Subchapters are a core part of Battle Cat's gameplay. Combined, they make up the vast majority of stages that a player will end up playing. Subchapters can be a great way to show the players new mechanics, enemies, or stage concepts, all without requiring too much of a content overhaul from Ponos. There's a ton of subchapters in the game, 110 different ones as of today, and I decided that it would be a pretty fun idea to rank them all from worst to best. I'm going to be ranking these subchapters on a handful of different criteria. The quality of each individual stage in the subchapter is pretty important, as having a lot of fillers or bad stages aren't going to make a subchapter too good. Likewise, the subchapter should also have some standout stages that prove to be very memorable, whether difficult or just interesting. Memorability as a whole is one of the most important factors, as if a subchapter is forgettable, it might not have been worth your time, but it would be a core part of your gameplay experience if it was memorable. Originality is also a good thing to have in a subchapter, as you don't want your subchapters to feel samey or copy-pasted. The last aspect I can think of is how complete the subchapter feels overall, which is just whether it fits well with itself, provides a good cut-and-dry experience, and works well as a subchapter, a select part of the overall Legend series as a whole that contributes to the quality of the entire experience. Because we have so many different subchapters, there's going to be a lot of quality difference between the absolute worst and absolute best. This is also going to take a very long time, because I have to rank 110 different subchapters. So strap in and get ready, because we're about to rank every Legend subchapter in the Battle Cats right now. Starting off with the F tier. These subchapters are pretty much a waste of time and space. They would be better off replaced with pretty much anything, with how meaningless they are, and they definitely deserve to be known as the worst subchapters in the game. Starting off with 110. What is the worst subchapter in the game, you might ask? Well, my choice for the bottom pick has to go to Never Ending Cat Story, or Stories of Legend 11. Remember what I just discussed for what makes a subchapter good? Well, throw it out the window, because this subchapter has absolutely none of those qualities. Literally every stage is just a blatantly copy-pasted version of a prior stage, just with higher magnifications. This subchapter does not have a single redeeming quality. There are 0 memorable stages, none of them are particularly good either, nor difficult at all, and don't even have a coherent theme. You can't really give any sort of compliment to Never Ending Cat Story, which is why it's my pick for the absolute bottom of the barrel when it comes to subchapters. 109. Castle of Fish. This subchapter is basically the same thing as Never Ending Cat Story, except it's a copy of Glucosamine Desert instead of Passionland. Same issues and no redeemable qualities. You could say that this one goes lower because it's even less original by reusing a gimmick, but I think Never Ending Cat Story gets the bottom spot because it started the trend where early Stories of Legends at this point kept reusing way too much content from previous subchapters, which single-handedly made early Stories of Legends a lot worse. Nevertheless, Castle of Fish is pretty much equally as bad. 108. Eminent Disaster. And now for the third copy and pasted subchapter in a row. This one comes much later though, being at the tail end of Uncanny Legends. While it isn't a complete copy and paste, it might as well be, considering the only change made from the original subchapter to this one is the addition of Aku Doges in its singular stage, along with an Aku altar. While it does have the benefit of being more challenging than the previous 2 subchapters, the Aku Doges don't even affect the stage much, as the strategy is still identical. You use crowd control units to subdue Relic Bun Bun. This subchapter could have had a lot of potential, but it was wasted on a boring rehash of a single stage. 107. Moodist Beach. Our first completely original subchapter on this list, except not really. It's a gimmick subchapter a lot like the Grotesque Gallery, except what Grotesque Gallery had in originality, Moodist Beach captures absolutely none of that, with even less fun stages. Tear-Soaked Puppy is a remake of Cubist Crimes, except with Little Doge RNG added. on a stage that straight up kills you if you don't one-shot the base or take too long. Isn't that just wonderful? The other stages either have boring or straight up reused gimmicks, and the final stage isn't a gimmick stage but just a completely normal stage thrown in. Ancient Sea Blues isn't the worst stage, introducing 2 new enemies in JJ Jackrabbit and Golem Sunfish, but it isn't the best either, and is in no way enough to place this complete joke of a subchapter any higher. Next up, we have D tier, which is filled with subchapters that I consider pretty flawed in a lot of ways, whether being extremely forgettable or just filled with tons of bad stages. These subchapters could have been improved in a lot of ways. I do think that these subchapters do have some form of merit, however, but the good just doesn't outweigh the bad for me. 106, Laboratory Island. I hate this subchapter. It's one of the most forgettable and meaningless subchapters in UL, a point in the game where you'd think Ponos would be good enough with stage design to consistently make good subchapters. And while they do for the most part, Laboratory Island sticks out as a subchapter where you can't really remember a single stage from, as every stage here is just mediocre at best and annoying at worst. Not even challenging in a good way, but annoying with how much RNG can be at play with the stages like Formalin Marina and Microscope Bridge. There aren't even any new enemies introduced. While it does feel coherent as a subchapter, the complete lack of anything of note makes this one of the most soulless subchapters in the whole game, and one that I'll personally be hating on for the end of time. 105, Dawn of the Beginning. This is another nothing burger of a subchapter. Pretty much every stage here is forgettable or just not very good. This subchapter also has no new enemy introduced. Dilemma of Birth is a well-known barrier stacking stage, but we've seen these types of stages before already. This subchapter does have Passionate Release, however, which is an alright stage, but more importantly, is named after a very specific action. Given how this entire subchapter's stages are named after Birth and Beginning, it doesn't take much to put 2 and 2 together to realize what Passionate Release is alluding to. So yeah, that's a stage name that exists. 104, Here Be Dragons. For being the first normal subchapter in UL, you'd think that a whole Legend Saga worth of stage designing experience would have been enough for Ponos to start making great subchapters. But well, Here Be Dragons is a subchapter highly derivative of Stories of Legends Subchapter 2, which is not suited for UL tier gameplay. Half of the subchapter is way too easy and boring, and while the other half isn't bad, it's not exactly what I'd call good either. Old Horn is introduced here, and by introduced I mean there's a stage that spawns a single Old Horn and nothing else. Mince Hill at the end of the subchapter brings him justice, but that isn't enough to compensate for how many misses this subchapter has. 103, Marine Ministry. This subchapter is a gimmick subchapter like Moodist Beach, but the stages are at least a lot more functional. Multi-Tetrapod is a pretty funny stage, but outside of that, the rest of the subchapter is pretty lackluster and boring. 102, Garden of Wilted Thoughts. As the first subchapter with a legend boss in Zero Legends, this particular subchapter has a lot to live up to. It's meant to set the standard for Zero Legends bosses, similar to how Ururun and Dogumaru set the standard for their saga's respective boss rosters. So, does it live up to expectations? Not in the slightest. The first 5 stages range from rather lacking to laughably bad when it comes to stage design, but the cherry on top of this steaming pile of garbage is none other than adherence to virtue. Where do I even begin? This stage is an absolute affront to stage design, boss design, and Battle Cats as a whole. The boss, Socrates, seems like he came straight out of a 9-year-old's Battle Cats boss concept. Unlike every other boss in the game, Socrates doesn't have any weaknesses. He has very high HP, monstrous pushing power, excellent range and pierce, and is resistant to crowd control. This is in stark contrast to pretty much every other boss in the game. Zero Luza is a good example. He has very high HP, a monstrous attack stat, and is excellent range and pierce. So what's the difference? Zero Luza can't push on his own. That's his weakness. He's really slow and easy to keep at bay when alone. Socrates takes that concept and laughs in its face. Socrates simply does everything. He's so oppressive that his stage is literally just him and Doge Darks, because if he had support that was any stronger, the stage would become literally impossible. There's no freedom when it comes to strategy either. Socrates is so stupidly restrictive on how you fight him that you're pretty much forced to run Octo and Cyberpunk. There is no other strategy to beat him for the average player, which goes against what Battle Cats is all about. Good stages allow you to express your playstyle while still being fun and challenging, but this stage does the exact opposite. I know that players were waiting for a new stage to step up in difficulty, but this definitely isn't the way to do it. The only redeeming factor is that the BGM for the stage is very well composed, though at this point we're just grasping for straws to find any sort of positives. So as the first Zero Legends boss, Socrates fails miserably at creating an engaging boss fight, unlike Ururun and Dogumaru's fights. And speaking of Dogumaru, 101 Depths of My Heart. Now, let me get this straight. Primitive Souls is an amazing stage, and Dogumaru is an amazing boss. So why is this subchapter so low, you might ask? This subchapter has some of the most embarrassingly bad stages ever made in UL. A Joyful Song is just 2 Moths, an Otham, and Relic Doges, with 0 pushing power on the field, and no threat at all. Cave Maidens is even worse, which is just random low power alien enemies as the entire stage. Hermit Chatterbox is 8 Project A's and random zombie peons. And don't get me started on Good Spirits, which is literally 2 toucans and some Sorrels. These stages are just so bad and make no impressions on the player whatsoever that the entire subchapter's quality is compromised to be one of the worst, with Primitive Souls essentially being a singular gold bar in an entire landfill of garbage. Woods of Resentment is another okay stage, but one great stage, one decent stage, and 4 utter garbage stages do not make a good subchapter in my opinion. Moving on to C tier. These subchapters are not too bad, just pretty average and okayish for the most part. A lot of these subchapters lack memorability and are very mediocre, but do have a few good points which make them reasonable to exist. 100. ZL12, translated to Karume Utopia. This is the first ZL subchapter on this list aside from Garden of Wilted Thoughts, and it suffers from pretty much the same issue. All of the stages are incredibly boring and easy, some of them even looking like they could appear in Stories of Legends, which is not a compliment. Dr. KO is introduced here. He's a pretty nothing enemy, but does add a small amount of memorability to this unremarkable subchapter. This is also the newest subchapter on this list, which doesn't give the future of ZL a very good look. 99. A New Legend. This is a single stage subchapter featuring an ancient curse, which is the boss fight against Relic Bunbun. This is a pretty infamous fight, requiring proper relic counters to make the stage possible, with little counterplay otherwise. This is also one of the most common places for players to outright drop the game because they got stuck and didn't want to get past this roadblock. While I do think the fight is flawed, there are a lot of redeeming aspects of the stage thematically and within the bigger picture of the game. It really does feel like the proper entrance test to get into UL, and it's a stage which you'll feel really good to get past. But overall, A New Legend is pretty lacking, with just a few good things for it to narrowly make it to C tier. Oh, and it looks like we've reached that point of the list where there's going to be a giant spam of early Stories of Legend. The earliest subchapters of Stories of Legend are filled with a ton of filler and pretty forgettable, so I just decided to group most of them right here. We're gonna go through them like it's a lightning round, starting with 98, Glucosamine Desert. This subchapter introduces Celebudo and Dachshund. Apart from that, nothing is really notable. 97, Sushi Island. This subchapter introduces director Kurosawa. Apart from that, nothing else is really notable. 96, Bamboo Island. This subchapter introduces Rain D, quite a lot of them. Apart from that, nothing else is really notable. 95, Swimming Cats. This subchapter introduces the Sloth, a very memorable and powerful backliner. Apart from that, nothing else is really notable. 94, The Scratching Post. This is a subchapter with pretty mediocre stages and some remakes of stages from risque terrain. One of these is Crunchy Pillar, which was a somewhat difficult stage back in the day, but aside from that, it's not very notable. 93. Western Street. This subchapter introduces JK Bun Bun. The fight itself against him is pretty difficult for some new players, so he might be a little memorable. Besides that, nothing else is really notable here. 92. Passionland. This subchapter introduces Master A, who is a really big early game menace which will bully the player for many subchapters to come. Aside from that, this subchapter is, you guessed it, not very notable. 91. Risque Terrain. A pretty nice subchapter for early game. Twin Peaks is a decent stage, and Thriller Bridge is also pretty good. They aren't exceptionally good though, as this is just early game. But besides those two stages, and the new Auto enemy, it's not very notable. 90. Squishy Cave. This subchapter introduces Kamel, one of the most vicious and toxic enemies in the entire game. Kamel alone is notable, but the introduction stage, Chubby Bee Goody, is also the first stage ever to use an Assassin Bear timer, where if you don't win in 15 minutes, Assassin Bears spawn to kill you. In a way, this is supposed to teach you how to lure, but not many players actually end up doing that anyways. But besides that stage, nothing else is notable. 89. Parthenon. This subchapter introduces Metal One Horn, which demands a critical hitter. It also introduces Bun Bun Black in one of the first well-designed stages, Labyrinth of Hades. In this stage, Corey and Bun Bun Black create good synergy and lead to a deadly combo where the player has to be mindful of what they spawn. It's a good stage, but outside of that, nothing else is notable. 88. Sea of Tuna. This subchapter actually has a decent amount of interesting stages. Boar is introduced here, one of the most threatening new enemies the player sees. Blue Ocean is also one of the first rush stages ever, and leaves a good impression on what they can be like. Frozen Tuna Front has the player deal with all the new Stories of Legend enemies in a timely manner, and Cave Fillet has the player fight Bun Bun with Nyandem as the backliner, a difficult combo for the players new to the game. While the other stages are pure fillers, this subchapter isn't too bad overall. It's actually pretty good for Stories of Legend standards, I would say. 87. Volcanos Volcano. There's a few interesting stages in this subchapter, such as Volcanic Defender, where you have to defend against a massive Shy Boy Rush and Bun Bun, as well as Corey's introductory stage, Flame Caldera. Corey is one of the most unique and memorable enemies introduced early on, being the first enemy with a wave attack in the game. Due to this nature, he makes this subchapter in particular pretty memorable, though, even with the power of Corey, the amount of fillers in this subchapter, as with all early Stories of Legend, does bring down the quality by a good amount, placing it right here. Alright, we're out of the early Stories of Legend wall now, so let's get back to regular subchapters. 86. Ancient Mountains. A pretty underwhelming subchapter, with not many standout stages. Most of these stages are remakes of early Stories of Legend stages, but remade in an uninteresting way without much challenge. Out of these, Abandoned Desire is the most interesting, being a battle against some Cappies and Puffingtons, which is an interesting set of enemy dynamics, but besides that, this subchapter really isn't too interesting. 85. Pumping Titanium. This is a pretty underwhelming subchapter with a lot of gimmick stages or pretty boring ones. Coronium does get introduced here, but in a very boring way, being swarmed by a ton of peons. The one highlight from this subchapter is Protein Cartel, a very interesting way to force the player to handle a ton of gobbles while also not luring to their base, which makes a pretty deadly and memorable fight. A lot of people might actually not like these very difficult stages, but I'm a big fan of them personally. They create interesting and memorable roadblocks that will get the player to remember the stages, and maybe the subchapter as a whole. But besides Protein Cartel, this subchapter is pretty lackluster. 84. Demon of Desoliter Bay. This ZL subchapter is pretty mediocre compared to a lot of other subchapters. Stages range from incredibly easy to just alright. 1 + 2 = Tor is a somewhat threatening looking stage but isn't that interesting, and Isosceles Valley used to be interesting due to having a 250% winged piggy, until they nerfed it back down to 150%, making the stage no longer threatening. The final stage against Baku is really easy and boring, and so the subchapter overall isn't the greatest. 83. Windless Island. This subchapter has a lot of gimmick stages, but a few of them are actually pretty memorable. Drunken Back Rub is pretty infamous for being a single target enemy spam that's a meat shield check, while Perfume Room is a silly spam of buffed bloggers. Though, the real standout from this subchapter is Houses of the Holy, a very well designed stage that utilizes the Doge base alongside only low to medium health peons to create a dangerous environment without a true backliner. It was one of the most interesting stages upon release, and to this day is just a pretty good stage. Every other stage here is pretty much forgettable, so this subchapter won't go any higher. 82. Scars of Lore. This is the introductory subchapter for the alien trait to join Stories of Legend, but it's a pretty forgettable one at that. There's 8 total stages, and most are pretty generic and non-threatening. Kugelschreiber is the first stage with an enemy limit of 1, and inspired future boss rush stages, while Minefield, Sunset Soldier, and Father's Back were mildly challenging stages at the time. Pretty mediocre overall. I doubt you'd remember much besides the new trait with this one. 81. The Endless Wood. One of the earliest subchapters in UL. Stages here are pretty easy but do a decent job at showcasing how some of the new relic enemies can play out. The remakes here are pretty decent, and John Ghoul in particular is a good introduction to showcase how brutal the pushing power of Sir Rel can be. It's just okay overall. 80. Pararilla Peninsula. A pretty early UL subchapter without many interesting stages. Most stages here are pretty decent, just not very memorable, with sole exception being Heron's Call, a pretty big difficulty spike for this early on in UL, which has you fight Emost alongside a dangerous backline and angel enemy support. Pretty good stage, especially after they remove the infinite Sir Rel, but this subchapter is not really interesting besides that stage. 79. Konjac Valley. This is one of the newest subchapters in the game, and is pretty average overall. None of the stages stick out, but the new enemy, Dober Dark, is a pretty decent addition to the game. 78. The Gelatin Mines. The fight against Urz is pretty pathetic overall, with how many cheesy ways there are to just kill her before support comes. Pair a disappointing boss fight with some other mediocre stages, and this subchapter is far from the best. Stars in the Sewers and Gas-Powered Birds are decently interesting stages, but not really enough for this subchapter to place any higher. 77. Area 22. The introductory subchapter for Starred Aliens into Stories of Legend wasn't much better than the original Aliens. Most of the stages here are pretty easy or just empty and uninteresting overall. The newly introduced Yukan is a very deadly enemy, but the stage that it comes from is pretty empty. It's an okay way to introduce Starred Aliens, but it's no doubt that the star of this update was Cats of the Cosmos itself rather than these few stages. 76. Truth in Extremes. This is a rather interesting subchapter which has a very unique gimmick never seen before. What was it? Well, this is the first subchapter to cause the Mandela effect on its players. Well, this stage actually has stages in sets of 2, which are identical to one another aside from one singular enemy. For example, in the first and second stage, the only difference is that Mammoth is replaced with Cosmic Cyclone. While the concept is pretty interesting, the execution is very lacking, with 5 out of the 6 stages here feeling pretty boring overall. The sole exception is Misfortune in Sand, a very interesting fight against both pufferfish variants, with Aki and some other support enemies, which ends up playing pretty well. Although this stage and the concept are good, the failed execution prevents this from going any higher. 75. The Edge of Spacetime. The first real subchapter going into ZL, and just like UL's first normal subchapter, it isn't the best. While Crimes Against the Cosmos starts off with a bang by bringing back Godcat, and Zero Horizon uses all the bear variants in an interesting way, the other stages are pretty boring and not too memorable overall. Mini White Cyclone also isn't my favorite enemy, and doesn't make too much of an impact on the game overall. 74. Barking Bay. Yet another early UL subchapter. This one is pretty standard with all of its stages, being decent but not too interesting. The introduction of Loris and Young Cuttlefish is pretty good, but that's about it for this one. 73. Diver City. This UL subchapter has a gimmick where every stage has metal enemies. This goes about as good as you would expect, and a lot of stages feel pretty clunky or just gimmicky overall. Diversity Alkalinity commits war crimes by starting with the word diversity in a subchapter named Diversity, but is a pretty memorable stage for how problematic it can be to deal with metal enemies and St. Dober at the same time. Iron Sand Beach is a pretty good stage where you have to build up an anti-metal and regular DPS stack and gauge how hard you are pushing, but it is cheesable. Most other stages are pretty boring, but Cathode Influencer gets the award for the most boring enemy introductory stage ever made. We have Newcomer Reynard supported with just a few metal doges and one metal hippo. Okay then. Yeah, this could be in like Stories of Legend 20 and no one would notice a difference. This subchapter is interesting for its gimmick, but the execution, just like Truth in Extremes, is just lacking here. Now we have B tier, which is full of pretty decent subchapters. They might not be the most standout ones, or they could be a mix of pretty good and pretty bad stages, but overall, I'm glad that each of these subchapters are in the game, and I do remember enjoying my time with most of them. 72, Coup de Chat, which is French by the way, and is a reference to the coup d'etat mixed in with the word for cat. But anyways, this is a somewhat gimmicky subchapter with some boring stages and some memorable ones. Snitches Get Stitches is a pretty interesting slow battle against a bunch of LD enemies, and the Red Cat Gambit is a boss rush against a few of the new relic boss enemies you've seen up to that point. The other stages like Cricket Ideology are pretty okay, but I do think that this gimmick subchapter does serve as a nice refresher in between the more regular subchapters. 71, Grotesque Gallery. The very first gimmick subchapter in the Legend Saga, it was pretty disliked overall for its gimmicky nature of stages and difference compared to normal subchapters. Looking at it nowadays, I do think that while it is very flawed, this subchapter provides a new and unique experience, and acts as a great refresher in late SOL. A lot of players I've known have enjoyed the puzzle-like nature of it, and are happy to come back to clear this one in starred difficulty. Killing the enemy base in one hit, rushing down a doge base, abusing Miss Sign Cheese, and more are all interesting gimmicks, where while they may not always hit in the gameplay department, you definitely are going to remember them. 70, The Legend Begins. This is the very first subchapter in Stories of Legend, and I think it does a great job at showing the player what Stories of Legend can be. 3 new enemies are introduced here, 2 of which are brand new traits which the player has never seen before, being Metal and Black. A lot of the stages also function uniquely from each other, and it does feel like a very complete introduction to Legend stages moving forward. Of course, there are still some fillers, and the stages aren't the most challenging, but I do think Ponos did what they could to make this subchapter interesting. 69, Stratospheric Pathway. A pretty alright subchapter in ZL, this one introduces 2 new Sage enemies in Dojeinstein and Tercerial. The stages themselves aren't too memorable, but they are decently well made. It's just your average ZL subchapter with not too much bad or good, which is fine. 68, Exile's Resort. A pretty basic and usual UL subchapter with a few good and bad stages. A private rainforest is a difficult encounter with Cadaver Bear, Spa of Ascension is a pretty deadly encounter with some angel enemies and Kurosawa, and Wonders of Nature shows a pretty interesting dynamic between Emost and Yukan. The other stages aren't the best though, with some like 13th Ward Resident being one of the most nonsensical and meaningless stages in the game. It's a mixed bag, but good overall. 67, Battle Royale. A very basic subchapter without much memorability, although the stages here are pretty well designed. Chick-fil-A, one of the best enemies in the game, is introduced here, albeit in a pretty easy and not that good of a stage. Scent of Gore and Fish has the player jump scared with a giant spam of bosses to have to fight after a while, which is kind of funny, and we also have Angry Fighting, a very infamous stage where 3 black angry elephants kick your ass because they just do. The other stages aren't bad, but most people won't remember much from this one. 66, Ghost Sea. A pretty standard UL subchapter without too much memorability. This is actually the subchapter where having all the Cats of the Cosmos crystals becomes the standard, so it's another place where people end up dropping the game. Apart from that, Nautilus Tomb is a pretty interesting stage, forcing the player to deal with Mr. Moles behind a gravy, and Endless Dead Zone is a slow playing stage that is kind of interesting, but the enemies are a tad too weak. Luckily, Star difficulty comes in to save that one. Overall, I'd say it's decent. 65. Primeval Currents. A pretty usual early UL subchapter with a few standout stages. Pelcatio Waters is infamous for its high density with strong pushing enemies, and Rutsborg Vortex is a pretty good and threatening introductory stage for Otham, showing how powerful Curse can be as a support ability. Besides those two, the rest of the subchapter is pretty average, which makes its overall quality place the subchapter right here. 64. Abyss Gazers. A decent early UL subchapter with decent stages. Inspirational Mural is a pretty infamous stage to try to rush, Glittering Peaks can be a challenging one to take out with lower levels, and Languid Lakeside introduces Loki in a pretty decent fashion. The rest of the stages aren't bad, just pretty standard overall. 63. Neo Necropolis. Pretty similar to the previous subchapter, it's a pretty decent UL subchapter with not much of note. Midnight Lycopene is a check for Cast the Cosmos 2 crystals, and Unmanned Station introduces Emost, a very powerful pushing enemy. The other stages are actually pretty decent, but the lack of memorability overall prevents this subchapter from going any higher. 62. Castle of the Sentinels. This subchapter follows the trend of most of the subchapters from UL 27 to 38, where almost all of them have a certain gimmick or twist to the stages in them. For example, Diver's City had metal enemies in all stages. This subchapter's gimmick is a little hard to notice, but you might feel like something is off when you're playing. That's because Castle of the Sentinels has no peons in any of its stages. It utilizes this gimmick fairly well, creating many mini-boss centric stages where every threat on the map is important to deal with. Stages like Confront the Tyrant, Disaster Cycle, and Border Between Worlds come to mind, but this subchapter's stages aren't the most interesting overall. Decent gimmick, decent stages, and decent execution. So this subchapter is a pretty decent one. 61. Quarantine Isles. A pretty average subchapter with mostly semi-notable stages, depending on what the player has. Bionic Seaweed was an infamous metal-heavy stage back in the day, which took a good amount of luck to beat. The other stages are mildly interesting in their own ways, but the final stage to introduce Big Sow, which is the Infected King, is a pretty mixed bag. I do think that the initial fight against Big Sow is very unique and pretty well done, but why are there 4 Camels? The cleanup in this stage may be one of the worst in the entire game, where you spend way too much of your time slowly fighting Camels one by one with a lineup not even meant to fight them. I think the Ponos employee designing this stage just had a bad day, and decided to unleash his wrath to all BC players by just adding 3 more Camels than needed to this stage, and making sure that any would-be enjoyment from this stage gets nullified. But anyways, this subchapter is pretty decent. 60. Heaven's Back Alley. Another typical UL subchapter with pretty decent stages. Bathtub of Whimsy is an interesting challenge against a lot of buffed Brawlos. Tidy Kitchen has a lot of possible ways to tackle it, and Fainting Porch is an interesting usage of enemy limit. A lot of these stages are remakes of existing stages, and I think they are pretty well done overall. 59. Low Tide Beach. This is around the point where Stories of Legend really starts to pick up speed as it builds up to the player's encounter with Urun Wolf. This subchapter is actually rather iconic, having multiple good and memorable stages, Star Ocean being the most obvious example. The introduction of H-Nut is rather good, doing a lot with just a few enemies, and really showcases his ability to stick around for a long time. Other notable stages are Beached Mammals for its difficulty, and Apple Bobbing Ocean for its gang of comically buffed Squirrels popping out upon hitting the base. Definitely a noticeable step up in quality. 58. New World Ehen. This subchapter stands out from every other subchapter in the game for just one reason: the stage names. This subchapter has some of the most nonsensical and funny stage names in the entire game, including The Heck Are You Island, What the Waterway, Oh No Road, and whole lot of something. Even if the content of the stages themselves isn't that good, you're still gonna have a fun time playing through this just to see which stage is next. Content-wise, these stages are about average, but their names alone are enough to give them quite a bit more memorability than most subchapters. 57. Cat's Cradle Basin. Probably one of the better ZL chapters in the game. A lot of these stages are pretty memorable from their enemy compositions. From Loony Lakeside having lots of dangerous relic enemies and red energy, to Muddy Fjord bringing back Corrupted Valkyrie for a well-balanced endgame fight, this subchapter is a pretty nice one overall, and honestly what I thought ZL was going to be more like. 56. Dead End Night. This is another early SOL subchapter which features Lil Nyandem. The fight against him is alright, but the other stages range from pretty good, like Black Premonition or Broken Mask, to pretty bad, like Feast of Betrayal and Catharsis End. The latter one, which is one of the most nonsensical stages ever created. It's a pretty mixed bag, but you might remember this subchapter anyways due to Little Nyandem. Hey there, you still awake? Well, we're halfway done with the list now. Isn't that just great? From now on, a lot of my comments about these stages are going to be on the more positive end. 55. Bazaar of the Pirate King. Another pretty decent overall subchapter. This one is filled with run-of-the-mill average stages. In particular, Retreat of the Living Dead is a pretty difficult stage without the right units, and Independence Day is a good introduction to Great Angel Chibinau, who is a very nice enemy. Not much else is too notable, but those other stages are far from bad. 54. Cherry Isles. A pretty early UL subchapter that focuses on remaking Volcanos Volcano. A lot of the remakes of the notable stages from that subchapter are made notable yet again for this one, like Sage of the Peak and Raging Caldera. The final stage in Super Volcano is also a good cherry on top to this pretty nice subchapter. 53. Singularityville. A rather fun subchapter from the tail end of Stories of Legend. It has a fair amount of unique and memorable stages, like 8K Fertilizer, which has you face off against Auros supported with a nasty synergy of dark auras that act as a shield, along with Kurosawa in the back to prevent you from pushing too hard. There's also Haunted Genome, which is a very memorable stage, allowing the player to wave stack on Ultra Baba and have the thrill of wreaking havoc on all the enemies in the base. There's also the Anomaly of Wearable Homes, a seemingly trivial stage that somehow seems to trip up many players. I've seen several people rage at this one, but I can't really figure out why. Nonetheless, it's still a fun experience. 52. Feeder of Fear. The theme of this subchapter is that every stage is built around a singular trait with the curse base. It's a pretty interesting theme, but most stages in this subchapter aren't the most memorable, albeit aren't really bad either. I think the strength of this subchapter comes from how it presents itself as a whole, a uniquely themed experience that is really more than the sum of its parts. 51. Cats of a Common Sea. Another pretty good ZL subchapter, with mostly average stages but a few good ones. Great Barrier Free is a good introduction to Mega Baba, and 2 Miles Below is an interesting combination of enemies with multiple solutions. But the most memorable stage here by far is Beyond the Hadal, an excellent stage where you fight both Alien and Angel Lionel at the same time, with proper support in the form of Goku Raku and Cyberhorns. The supports and peons work very well with the double backliner, and the stage provides a moderate challenge that is very well balanced and satisfying to play. I'd say it's definitely one of the best stages in CL right now, and a very strong part of this subchapter. 50. Axis of Evil. This subchapter is filled with lots of iconic stages, but not all of them are the best designed. Technocracy is a pretty well known and constructed hard-pushing stage, and Close Encounters is a nice opposite, a slower and more timing-based short stage. Pecking Order is also fine, but the other 3 stages in this subchapter aren't as great. Merciless Onslaught is just an Assassin Bear enemy limit gimmick, and The Spy Who Pet Me is a mediocre introduction to one of the most polarizing enemies in the game. And then there's Celestial Seas. Can we remove Celestial Seas from the game? Thanks. 49. Roads of Torment. You heard it a bunch at this point, but it's yet another pretty decent UL subchapter. Pretty decent stages all around the board, such as Lord's Lecture, a stage that slowly spawns more threatening alien bosses as you progress through the enemies in this stage. Total Myopia is also in this subchapter, the first metal-heavy stage that poses somewhat of a challenge at UL, and while it is pretty good, it may have started a trend of pairing Loris with Sir Metal Seal and other metal enemies, a concept which repeats itself a good few too many times. 48. Morningstar Isle. And speaking of Loris plus Sir Metal Seal, Morningstar Isle has Planetarium Love, a stage with only those two enemies. While that isn't the best, the other stages in this subchapter make up for it. Curry Comet is a real cool and dangerous combination of the enemies that is very difficult to tackle head on. And Rainbow Bridge Tool introduces everyone's favorite triple-traded chameleon in Johnny Leon. The subchapter ends with Cats in the Stars, introducing the curse space in a pretty good fashion by pairing it with lots of black enemies, which typically get hard countered because of their black trait. It's a nice subchapter overall. 47. Ancient Forest Labyrinth. This subchapter is a very mixed bag. Every stage here except the final one has a surge base, and as you could expect, they don't play the best. A few notable ones are Reincarnation Ring, which has you fighting a few problematic red enemies and Randy, and Sappy Underpass for pairing Miss Haka with a few pretty good support enemies. The real saving grace for the subchapter though is the fight against Doron in the final stage, the Face of God. This is an extremely well done boss fight with lots of balanced difficulty, unique mechanics, and just one of the stages I see a ton of people really liking. With such an incredible stage placed among these other very flawed ones, this subchapter overall goes around here. 46. IT Catacombs. This is another mixed bag of a subchapter. Caliban's Keeper and OS Graveyard proved to be the most well-designed stages in this subchapter, while Throne of Phone and the Holy Exploit are both well known for not so great reasons. The other two stages in Dial-Up Dreams and Broadband Omens are pretty forgettable and don't have much substance, but the second one introduces Crockley, a pretty decent slowing enemy. Take the average quality of these stages and you'll get a spot around here, pretty close to the middle. 45. In the Sleeping Forest. This is a similar situation to Ancient Forest Labyrinth in multiple ways. Every stage in this subchapter has an animated base. Most of the stages here don't make much of an impact, but the two that do are very well done. Happily Ever After introduces the Surge base, a pretty controversial and not very well used enemy, but the stage itself plays very smoothly and provides a nice endurance challenge where you chip away at some backliner support enemies. The other notable stage here is a pretty infamous one that most of you absolutely despise, but I'm not gonna hold back anything and I'll say it's the best stage in the entirety of UL that isn't a boss stage. Glass Slippers. It's a genuinely amazing stage with a very cool and interesting concept, near flawless execution, and just the right amount of challenge to make it extremely memorable. Glass Slippers is a masterpiece. Things do get extremely dicey once you touch star difficulty, but this list is mostly based off 1-star gameplay, so for this part it's just a fantastic stage. Basically, you'll only remember this subchapter for 2 stages, and you probably hate those 2 stages, but I think it's pretty neat. 44. Between Truth and Lies. The last subchapter in UL before the big 12.0 update, this one does a pretty good job at standing out. Most of these stages are just pretty decent or good stages, like Full Stop Valley being a very interesting triple boss stage where prioritizing killing any of the 3 first is a viable strategy, or Eternal Ancient Woods, a memorable stage where you try to take down Midnight D's supported by Golem Sunfish. The overall vibes you get from a lot of these stages in this subchapter are pretty off-putting and unique. I can't really put my finger on it, you might just know what I'm talking about if you've played this one. Still, it's a solid subchapter with pretty good stages. 43. Battle in the Bath. Another well-rounded UL subchapter with good quality. Some standout stages are Sticky Shower, a pretty nice fight against some alien enemies and Rain D, and Hot Spring Reception, the introductory stage for the objective best enemy in the game, Mr. Puffington. It's a great introductory stage for an even greater enemy, and is really what makes this subchapter pop out compared to others. 42. Behemoth's Peak. A pretty decent subchapter all around. Most stages here are pretty average, including Immortal Zenith, the boss fight against Nala, which is a pretty underwhelming stage, and an average fight at best for a legend boss. Beyond the Haze is probably the most interesting stage here. pairing Emost with Condemned Pangs for a very deadly combination, and a very welcome hard but fair difficulty spike that's always needed in a place like UL. 41. Stairway to Darkness. A very solid early SOL subchapter that has a few great stages. Safe and Not Sorry is a dangerous introduction to Pigeon Disable, and Red Alert is a memorable stage that is one of the first to heavily focus on a single trait, which you guessed it, is red. Underground having you fight 3 Bun Bun variants at the same time is also a very scary idea at the time, nicely wrapping up this pretty well done subchapter. 40. Law of the Wildlands. One of the most memorable and dangerous subchapters in early UL. A lot of these stages are well known for a reason. Panic Tower features the deadly 300% cadaver bears as threats, and No Hope Ranch is a particularly cash-starved stage where you have to fight 2 Emos and Lenores at the same time. Revolver Ridge is also a pretty good finale stage, featuring a lot of wave enemies alongside Loki to make for a pretty enjoyable experience. Out of all the early UL subchapters, this is by far the best one. 39. Capone's Jail. A very early Stories of Legend subchapter right after Urarun, and the stages here are pretty solid, or even original. Last Gang is the earliest stage where the gimmick is to rush the stage down before a timer enemy kills you, and King of Freedom is the first stage where enemy waves spawn by base HP percentage. These two gimmicks would inspire a long list of levels in the future, and had their origins with these two fairly innocuous stages. Prison Destruction and Pigpen Taboo were also fairly challenging and memorable stages back then. It's an overall solid subchapter, with quite the bit of everything included. 38. Laboratory of Relics. The final subchapter in Stories of Legend, after all your skills had been tested in the previous subchapter. It all culminates and comes down to this. So, what's waiting for you at the end? A boring, easy fight where all you do is stack necrodancers and proceed to demolish the boss. But wait, why is it so high up then? Well, that's because the reward for beating 4-star SOL is the fight against Edie. Edie is a great boss that does a much better job at testing your skill than Mechabun does. The simple yet effective stage design allowing you multiple ways to tackle her fight while still being challenging and fun no matter what route you decide to take. With one poorly designed fight paired with an amazing fight, it averages out and causes the subchapter to land here. Welcome to A tier, and every subchapter here is pretty good and just well designed overall. They might have a few flaws, but they end up being very memorable and good example subchapters for what I'd like to see in future subchapters. 37. Space-Time Distortion. If anything, this subchapter is proof that a subchapter isn't always about the quality of its individual stages. Space-Time Distortion features remakes of all 5 SOL boss fights, each with buff magnifications and extra Akudoge support. While these stages aren't the greatest or most original, they serve as a good flashback and breather compared to the rest of UL. The final stage, Hell's All-Stars, is a boss rush where you have to kill all 5 of these bosses in the same stage, and is honestly one of the most satisfying stages in concept to have ever been added to this game. The experience overall is what brings this subchapter this high, with the whole theming done excellent with the stages having the wrong backgrounds in the ending finale stage. I really do like the level of creativity behind the creation of this subchapter, and even if the stages aren't the most original or highest quality, that's okay, because this subchapter as a whole is really something to remember. 36. The Ururuvu Journals. This is a short ZL subchapter with just 4 stages, every single stage having Ururun Wolf. All 4 stages are actually balanced fairly well, and the concept itself is something pretty original and interesting. The best part of this subchapter is Sacrifice Apprenticeship, a stage where you have to fight Ururun and Yulala, daughter and father, at the same time. It's a challenging battle that makes sense both thematically and plays very uniquely. Oh, and just the cherry on top is that Ururun's buff in these stages actually utilizes split magnifications, where she has 300% HP and 500% damage. I think this extra care by Ponos to set the magnifications just right to where she has not too much HP but also enough damage to be threatening was a brilliant move. opponents should honestly do this more in the future when using special enemies in ZL. 35. Walk of Fame. From one legend to another, Walk of Fame is also a pretty good subchapter. Beverly Hills Scoop is notably difficult, combining two tricky enemies together, though the real star of the show is Inumusha in Multiversal Studios, the final legend unit before Mechabun. He serves as a great way to cap off the zombie-heavy part of SOL, being an engaging back and forth stage. The other enemy introduced in this stage, the Doge Base, synergizes quite well with Inumusha. He has a high knockback count, which means you'll naturally push him back a lot. The Doge Base's purpose is to shut down any attempts to rush down Inumusha before he gets a chance to shine, which it does pretty well. Unfortunately, power creep has hit the stage really hard, and the stage being demolished by units like Octo, Shigong, and more is a very common sighting. The remaining stages in this subchapter range from pretty good to pretty bad, especially Paparazzi Paradise, notable for being a stage that you can literally solo by pressing Awaken Bahamut once. How incredible. 34. Suburbs of the Dead. This is the introductory subchapter for zombie enemies, and it does a pretty good job at it. Zombies aren't present in every stage, and the ones without them are actually my favorites here, being Dungeon of Dreams and Ghostlight Gardens. Zombie-heavy stages like Swamp of Sacrifice, Revenant Road, and Silence Meowing are all great examples to showcase how deadly the abilities of Burrow and Revive can be used to support a push, and give you enough time to figure out how to counter them. It's a pretty well done introduction to zombie enemies, and a good subchapter overall. 33. The Devil's Academy. A very solid subchapter with a good catalog of stages. Lonely Goldfish makes a memorable traitless stage in UL without Arost, and Bell Collector is a fantastic remake of Harry Tunnel. A Classroom in Ruins and Campus Law are pretty decent as well, and you might remember Demon COO anyways because of how silly it is. It's a fun and playful subchapter, and one that I do look forward to coming back when I reach it. 32. Intrepid Cats. This subchapter is the only one in the entire game to have exactly 5 stages, and it uses those 5 well. The first 3 stages are pretty good, and Thorny Dialogue introduces Tacky, a pretty good enemy, in just a pretty bad way since most people rush the stage before he even does anything. The infamously difficult Dark Web is the final stage to this subchapter, and is actually a really well designed stage in how the difficulty is balanced and how the enemies flow together overall. It's a pretty short but pretty sweet subchapter for sure. 31. Blizzard Boulevard. This subchapter has a lot of very memorable stages. Shiver Junction is a nastily difficult stage that takes the already difficult Winged Piggy from the previous stage and has you fight 2 at a time. Scorched Tollbooth introduces Hacky, a polarizing but very good LD enemy, and is a fun overall stage due to forcing out an easy but satisfying Bahamut chain. And then there's Leaky Tunnel, one of the most memorable stages in all of Stories of Legend. This trauma-inducing stage is something that players at the time will never forget, especially Gardangle. Cats of the Cosmos Chapter 2 crystal owners will never understand. But yeah, the other stages in this subchapter are pretty decent as well, and that makes for a pretty memorable subchapter overall. 30. Unearthed Artifacts. One of the higher quality UL subchapters for sure. Poison Bog Cure is a pretty good chip install stage, and Patience Prevails has a well-balanced challenge with Henry, Mr. Mole, and Mesocosmo Cyclone. Cursing the Cursor is a very fun and well-designed stage that while it isn't the hardest, it certainly flows very well and feels like a good experience. While some other stages aren't that notable, the ones that are definitely give it the notability it needs to stand out. 29. Above and Below. A very interesting and difficult subchapter at times. Electric Bath pairs strong metal enemies with Henry for a unique combo. Boiling Spring combines a whole lot of dangerous red enemies, showing that single trait stages can still be difficult if done right. Steam to Death is a great introduction stage to Calamaria, and has a lot of ways to approach it. The other stages are pretty standard quality, but mineral treatment is pretty notorious for being a unit check. It's still a very good subchapter with all things considered. 28. Alcatraz. This is a real turning point in Stories of Legend where stages start going from random forgettable stages into actually memorable ones. Underground Base is the original triple elephant level that would inspire angry fighting later on, and Prison Prairie utilizes SBKs and HNUs to make a dangerous spam of enemies. Cat Trial is a pretty infamous DPS check stage where you need to burst down one horns in order to chip down a Camel. Two new enemies are also introduced here, being Arost and Dober PD, both of which are super iconic and very memorable threats that would eventually end up in some of the hardest stages in the game. This is such a good quality upgrade from the previous Stories of Legend subchapters, and for that, I'll place it here. 27. Rose-Colored Road. This is a terrifying subchapter with a lot of infamous stages. Speechless Tongues is a deadly combination between a harsh alien backline and a lot of Zangroos, one of the hardest stages in all of UL. Ashes Just Ahead, a complete joke of stage design, is also present, and although it is a terrible stage itself, it does bring memorability in the form of infamy towards the overall subchapter. The other stages are pretty decent, but Roast Meat Not Cities is a very fun stage where you fight two bosses at once and can cycle through them with different enemy combinations. It also has a really good name. Just a cool subchapter overall, in my opinion. 26. Ends of the Earth. For being the penultimate subchapter of SOL, it does a fantastic job at it. This subchapter tends to feel off, and that's because it doesn't use any of the newer traits in it like aliens or zombies. Each stage is designed uniquely from each other, and a good amount of them have lasting impressions from difficulty, such as Final Tower, Last Labyrinth, Cave Conclusion, and Apocalypse Temple. It's personally one of my favorite subchapters in the game, and it's a great way to end off Stories of Legend right before the finale. 25. Bikura, Harbor of Evil. The introduction stage into Aku UL started off with a real bang. A lot of great Aku enemy introduction stages, as well as some of the freshest stage names are here. Breakwater Blood Feud, Dried Fish Market, and Fishermen on Strike are really nice stages that make playing this subchapter feel fresh and interesting. It's a great subchapter that introduces a great enemy trait. 24. Nazi Go Round. All of the stages in this subchapter have names that are references to Asian culture, which is actually really cool to see. A lot of these stages are memorable as well, like Angkor SWAT combining Puffingtons and Big Styles for some really silly gameplay, and Kuala Lumpur being the capital of Malaysia, and also a very difficult stage where Reynards and Kamel pressure the player alongside strong Sir Rel spam. Fishlight Beauty and Poison on Rice are solid as well, but the other two stages aren't the greatest, especially Cowman Guys, a triple relic bun fight that quickly goes from a meme to an annoying unit check. Overall though, the pretty good stage pool and the nod to Asian culture places Nazi Go Round right here. 23. DNA Plantation. A pretty strange subchapter from the latter half of UL. It's one of the only subchapters in UL to feature no relic enemies, but more notably, this subchapter carries a very unique gimmick. It spams enemies that were never meant to be spammed in order to create a really unique experience that really isn't replicated by any other subchapter. Clone Farmers was so infamously difficult that Ponus decided to make an entire unit just to power creep the stage on 3-star difficulty. And Banana Genomes is also pretty rough with just the sheer amount of UCANs within the stage. It has a unique feel and you never really know what enemy is going to be spammed next. It also introduces Raging Gory, supported by a herd of hackies. The stage has a good concept, with the gang of hackies forcing you to keep your ground, though it is a bit on the easy side. Even with some filler, it ends up being a very memorable subchapter. 22. Mousy Land. One of the best zombie Stories of Legend subchapters, this one is filled with pretty fun stages all around. Greeter of the Gates and 50 Degrees Hotter introduce Coffin Zode and Zemel respectively, and are pretty memorable stages as well. Virtual Nightmare is a pretty interesting combination with Henry and a bunch of zombie enemies, and Rickety Coaster has you fight a ton of wave enemies in, well, waves. The final stage, the Haunted 1 LDK, is a really fun and well-designed stage that has you stack attackers on a gravy in order to counter Miss Haka. which plays out really satisfyingly. It's a wonderful subchapter and one that I'm always glad to come back to. 21. Beyond the Savannah. This subchapter has a ton of memorable stages, whether for difficulty, jokes, or a bit of both. Electro Safari and Heaven's Oasis were notoriously difficult stages for their time, with Heaven's Oasis still holding up today as the hardest one in Stories of Legend. On the other side of the coin, the Noble Tribe is an extremely memeable stage which is just overbuffed Empire of Cats Japan, and Nikumanjaro somehow manages to be threatening with just a single spacefish and Snaish spam. The other stages are pretty decent as well, and combined make up a very memorable subchapter. 20. Zero Field. The fight against Metafilibuster is a very good one, with great flow, difficulty balancing, and multiple ways to beat the stage. Although the stage isn't perfect, with its abuse of behemoth enemies, it's still one of the best boss fights in the game. You might wonder why this isn't higher, and that's because this is a subchapter tier list. While the stage itself is really good, that's all there is in this subchapter, and A Whole New World doesn't exactly feel like what you'd call the optimal subchapter, but instead just an optimal stage. We're at S tier now, and every single subchapter here is incredibly well done. These are some of the fan favorite subchapters in the game, and are filled with high quality, memorable, and very interesting stages. The overall experience of going through some of these subchapters is also a blast, and I think Ponos did a fantastic job at designing these. 19. Humanity Catified. A very solid and immersive experience to end off UL. You start by fighting the first 4 UL bosses again, but in completely different stages from their original. Then you fight all of them in a boss rush style stage, and unlock Mining Epic while in the middle of a subchapter. So you're apparently expected to stop playing, go out grind Mining Epic, and come back with UL True forms. Okay then. The following 3 stages introduced Behemoth Lusa, which is a very scary boss, but the first 2 stages are pretty uninteresting, and the last one, Birth of True Man, was designed in a stupid way that allows you to stall out all the dangerous enemies by waiting 11 minutes or so. It's really weird. This subchapter is far from perfect. There's a ton of flaws, weird parts, and overall clunkiness, but I think the experience overall is just really awesome to go through, and it does feel like a legendary ending to UL, so it's still worthy of S tier to me. 18. Prince of Darkness. A very interesting early SOL subchapter filled with memorable stages. A lot of these stages have room in their name, giving the overall subchapter an interesting feeling. The Bathroom is an infamous stage for giving new players trouble due to the multiple Arosts, and Torture Room is infamous for being one of the fastest stages in the game. VIP Room introduces Metal Doge, a peon who is fine enough at 100% magnification, and then the last 2 stages in Dictator's Garden and Satan's Bedroom both are challenging battles that are very fun as well. It's a very good subchapter all things considered, and I'd say there isn't much room to improve. 17. Forgotten Graves. This subchapter has another gimmick, which is that every single stage has both relic and zombie enemies. This matches the name very well, with relics being the forgotten and zombies being the graves. For this unique theme, you get a lot of great stages, like Second on Life, which pairs the classic Haunted 1LDK duo alongside Loris and Relic peons, and Defaced Tombstone, which is a very strong combination of Mr. Puffington and Cadaver Bear. Zolo is introduced in the last level, Sodden Bones, and while not every stage in this subchapter is a hit, the fact that it manages to pull off its theme so incredibly well is what makes the subchapter stick out from the rest. 16. Kombu Cape. This is a fan favorite subchapter with a lot of infamous mid-Stories of Legend stages. Weeping Dunes combines Henry, Hacky, and H-Nut to create a dangerous combo that you have to chip from afar. Golden Guy and Leadfoot Drive are slow pushing yet very dangerous stages that will have you using your backline units to fight against the enemy hordes. And Trouble at the Mansion introduces Lil Bun Bun, a great peon in a very nice stage, wrapping up what is just a very solid chapter overall, and one that I can understand why so many people like. 15. Drunken Foundry. A pretty underrated subchapter. Whether it be hordes of Metal Doges and 2 Puffingtons combined to create unique gameplay, we're fighting a total of 4 Othams in Unmoving Conveyor, this subchapter knows how to make difficult yet unique stages. VIP Warehouse is pretty much the stronger older brother of Campus Law, and Smokestack to Heaven, the introduction for Gobble, is a fantastic stage that utilizes many different types of enemies to create lots of interactions. There's a lot to like about Drunken Foundry, and it's just another reason why Urs to Doron is such a fantastic stretch of UL subchapters. 14. Cat Chasing Village. If any subchapter in the game should get an award for cleanliness, it should be this one. Every single stage is good, and it would take me too long to talk about them all, but in particular, Pit House Academy is a nice battle against Emost and Croakley with Loris support, and Out of This Village is a great introduction to Hani 1-1. This is what I call the textbook good UL subchapter, and it serves as a model for how to create clean stages for any subchapter. Oh yeah, and all the stages have relic enemies too, but in UL that gimmick doesn't really stand out too much. 13. Dead Heat Land. This is a really scary subchapter with a ton of threatening stages. Boiling Blood makes you fight multiple Akis with Kamel and turns them into a real threat if they stack up, while Hell's Crater combines Medusan and Dreadbore to make an incredibly dangerous combination. Fire Kingdom Dynamite is a classic chip and stall stage with your backliners, which plays pretty well, although some people aren't the biggest fan. This subchapter introduces 2 new enemies, one of which is Death Quarry in the second stage, which is pretty average. The final stage in Burning Sunset introduces Red Energy, and does so in a very balanced challenge of a stage. That stage also just looks really good visually for some reason, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just that red and blue Aku enemies go well together over a sunset background on a stage named Burning Sunset. But everything in this subchapter goes well together to make this yet another great subchapter of Aku UL. 12. Shadow Cosmopolis. Tons of memorable stages are in this subchapter, and a lot of really good ones too. Overachiever Central has you fight wave by wave of dangerous enemies, and Morning Rush Hour has you rush down a few Cappies and a Sunfish in order to win before more enemies spawn. Talking Massacre is a fine remake of Labyrinth of Hades with stronger variants of the 2 main bosses. And Subterranean Stalker is a unique stage which utilizes lots of peons alongside some LD enemies to push the player back without traditional pusher enemies. The last stage introduces Borophim, which is a pretty stat heavy enemy, but is fine enough to handle with trait counters. It's just a really clean and memorable subchapter without too many flaws. We're at SS tier now, and every single one of these last 11 subchapters are absolute gold mines of subchapters, with some of the most iconic stages in the game, and just some of the best overall quality. I think these 11 do a great job at representing how good Ponos can get with stage design, and subchapter design as well. Most of these subchapters have barely any to straight up no flaws, and I think that you'll remember most of them as we go on. 11. Silk Road. Making a subchapter in Stories of Legend with 8 stages have no bad stages at all is an incredible feat of itself, but combine that with how early Ponos managed to do it, and this subchapter deserves a lot of recognition. Each of the 8 stages plays in a unique and interesting way, adding new enemies or experiences that the player hasn't fought before. It's hard to choose a highlight since all of these stages are just too memorable, but Go Diego Pass in particular was one of the hardest stages in the game back then, and challenges the player to switch between playstyles to handle 3 different threats accordingly. This is a great subchapter for the game, and definitely one of the reasons why I consider a lot of early mid-SOL to be very underrated. Number 10. Body and Soul. Another super iconic subchapter filled to the brim with memorable stages. Gestalt Decay is a super infamous stage that used to destroy tons of Uber abusers who forgot Paris existed. Cursed Blizzards is a notorious rush stage where you have to beat up sloth variants quickly, and Love and Death introduces Mr. Mole in a challenging stage with lots of boars. There's too much to discuss here, but this is just one of the most memorable subchapters in the game from how challenging some of the stages here were at the time. It's great at making the player rage at a lot of the stages, and then feeling good when they finally beat them. Number 9. Weak and Mildly Acidic. One of the most memorable subchapters in Stories of Legend, this one is full of fun stages. At Least I'm a Cat is rather infamous for being rather difficult, with its waves of enemy spam combined with intrusive metal one-horns. While No More Bad Dreams was widely known to be difficult back then for its hard-to-handle quartet of bun-buns, the other stages have the theme of combining EOC bosses with their variants. Beautiful Finale introduces Toucan, a great enemy that pairs well with his support. The Brawlos and Lemurs encourage you to meat shield while Toucan uses those meat shields to decimate your attackers. But of course, the highlight of this subchapter is obviously Codename Red Riding, in her stage Learn to Love. Entering the stage, she seems innocuous enough, until you watch her shoot her bazooka and nearly snipe your base instantly. The shock upon seeing her LD range is nearly unparalleled in shock factor. As for the stage itself, it has a wide variety of enemies, including a lot of annoying long-ranged enemies like Echna, Lenore, and Sunfish Jones, along with Mina herself. The stage encourages you to lure the Echnas and pull off a somewhat tricky Bahamut chain in order to dispose of them efficiently and get huge damage on Mina. It's a fun rush stage that can be easily quite nerve-wracking as Mina slowly chips your base, killing you if you aren't fast enough. Her fight manages to be one of the most memorable in the game, being the first true rush stage in the game that doesn't depend on a death timer. Number 8. Galapa Goth. Another fan favorite subchapter here, and for good reason. Filled with 6 different stages that are all great in their own way, and there's lots of gameplay diversity, and it's just a great time. Starting with DNA and DHA making black enemies a big threat, to an actual good Assassin Bear stage in Twilight Poachers, where you kill the Assassin Bears in creative ways. Followed by Surviving Herd, which has you survive a rush of Brawlos and then chip down some backliners. After that, we have Alien Ecology, a great mixed metal stage with both threatening metal and non-metal enemies. With Heavenly Creatures next, a good fight against 2 spaced dwarfins with Kurosawa in the back. The subchapter ends with Conservation Society, introducing Henry, one of the most iconic and unique enemies in the game, and just an overall fantastic stage that teaches you to lure against Henry. It's such a well done bundle of stages that is a big part of why Mid Stories of Legend gets remembered so fondly by a lot of people. Number 7. Sea Polluter. This subchapter actually used to be Nurse Wufa's favorite subchapter in the game, and for good reason. Tons of unique and memorable stages come from here, as well as equally unique and memorable enemies. This subchapter actually introduces the most new enemies of any subchapter in the game, with 3. Oil Platform greets you and introduces you to Cappy, who's used to enhance JK Bunbun's pushing power by picking off your meat shields, leaving holes in your front line for him to smash his way through your defense. I'm On To You is the next stage to introduce an enemy, and is one of the most infamous stages in Stories of Legend. The stage only has one enemy, being Brawlo. Just one shows up at the beginning, being inconspicuous enough to allow the player to let their guard down before hitting the base and possibly getting steamrolled by a giant flock of Brawlos if they're unprepared. It's definitely not the most well-designed stage, but it's certainly memorable. Revolving Door Floats is a stage that finishes the subchapter, being Berserk Ori's first experience, accompanied by 2 other enemies introduced here, along with a normal Cory. The initial pair of Cappy and Cory showcases how dangerous she can be, applying constant pressure to the meat shield while Cory does the opposite, leading to a difficult duo to deal with. The boss wave consists of Berserk Ori and Brawlos. The stage has a really long base distance, so you can see how far Berserk Ori's waves can stretch. His insanely long reach allows him to wipe the field of meat shields, allowing Brawlo to sneak through and be a nuisance as Berserk Ori catches up, getting closer and closer until you kill him. This subchapter is also home to memorable stages that don't introduce new enemies, like Littering Coast, which many people know for its comically buffed up wall doge, and Waves of Assassin Bears, where if you don't have high enough cannon power, the solution to the stage actually gets pretty creative. Benzine Field is a troublesome stage that encourages you to be careful with how hard you push, and Government Watchdog being remembered for its ridiculous amount of dogs and teleboodles. Overall, this subchapter has tons of memorable and fun stages. Number 6. Jailbreak Tunnel. This is a legendary subchapter for a lot of reasons. It's the first Legend Boss subchapter, but it also marks a turning point where early SOL goes from being super easy and random to difficult and iconic stages again and again. All 6 stages in this subchapter focus on a different gameplay style, and are iconic for different reasons. Sin and Punishment is built around ranger stacks and has you fighting 3 Auras at once, a terrifying amount that is guaranteed to scare any new player who plays that stage. Prison Sentence is a DPS check style stage that pretty much filters out any player without basic true forms, Grace Cats, or good gacha units. Hairy Tunnel is a notoriously difficult stage where you have to handle 3 Cories in a very careful way to prevent your units from being melted. Deadfalls introduces Sir Metal Seal and is the first metal stage where a single crit isn't enough to finish the stage. Pitfall Zone is a long endurance stage that makes you play well and chip down a lot of long-ranged enemies in time before an assassin bear wave kills you. And the finale to this subchapter is the Great Escaper. I already explained in my boss ranking video why I think Ururun is such an excellent boss, but to summarize, it's a back and forth pressure stage that flows very well, challenges the player just the right amount, and has a drop that feels powerful enough to justify completing the challenge. All aspects thrown together makes this by far and away easily the best early Stories of Legend subchapter in the entire game, and what I consider the true start of Stories of Legends. Number 5. The Legend Ends. And just as the real start of Stories of Legend was a banger, the ending was amazing as well. This subchapter was heavily alluded to with Ends of the Earth, and it certainly does deliver on being a phenomenal send-off to Stories of Legend. Everything you have been through up until this point has culminated into this subchapter, the final test. Every stage tests a different skill you've learned on your journey. A Day of Reckoning is about careful money management to supply enough offense and defense to survive hordes of Gabriels. Thirst for Vengeance tests your ability to burst down a Razorback before support can catch up. Glory of Glories is more of a tanker stage, chipping and stalling Zamel while your other units handle Big Sal. A Moment of Serenity asks how well you can control and subdue a nasty combo of angels. False Resurrection requires good timing skills to sneak rushers into the blind spots of several LD enemies to get damage in. Goblet of the Oath checks barrier breakers and wave blocker, I guess. Twilight Zephyr promotes strategizing, bringing the right units to counter each boss, and Unkept Promises is, well, more symbolic than a real stage. As the final stage in the last real subchapter, it ends off right where it started. Remember, back in Korea, when it was just Cat and Doge. The final enemy is a Doge. And you know what the entire stage is about. It's about doing the thing you do after every single stage. Let's just destroy the base one more time. It's a great ending, as it really allows the player to reflect on how far they've come. And from one great finale to the next, Number 4. Sacred Forest. Zero Luz's boss fight is one of the best in the entire game, with so much to love about it. Great thematic design with Luz's scary appearance on the short stage, good pressure design from the peon choices and waves, and just the right amount of difficulty to make it feel like a challenge but also doable by most players. Ponos truly hit gold when they crafted this stage, and it marks a perfect ending to Uncanny Legends. Nowadays, I hold the opinion that it's the second best boss in the game, above Ururun Wolf, and I think that Revival of Origin is straight up the best stage in the entirety of all Legend sagas. If we were judging subchapters by average stage quality, this would be number 1, but because it's missing the collectiveness present in multi-stage subchapters, it falls just a little short of that spot in my opinion, holding still an amazing spot. These final 3 subchapters though, are at least to me, nothing short of masterpieces. Number 3. The Happy Lucky Temple. What is single-handedly the best executed gimmick subchapter in the game, and also UL's most memorable subchapter has to be the Happy Lucky Temple. Every stage in this subchapter is built around a different status effect, being knockback, slow, weaken, freeze, warp, and toxic. Some of the most memorable stages in UL are present here, like the Belated Priest, an infamously hard battle against Emost, and a lot of backliner support, with everything in the stage slowing you down. Adventurer's Journal is also a terrifyingly difficult stage, with a ton of threatening backliners paired with Henry and Zeal. Dark Lord's Decree is a super fun stage where you have to deal with Zolos and Gobbles by timing your units well and bringing the proper counters. These 3 stages are super memorable and well crafted. but the strength of this subchapter is that even the not as good stages are memorable because of the gimmick. You'll remember Pilgrim Agitators for having knockback only enemies, Choir Battle for having weaken only enemies, and Chapel Transfer for having warp enemies, minus the Yukan who was not invited to the party. This subchapter as a whole is one that every UL player knows and remembers because of how much of an impact it leaves, both difficulty-wise and thematically. Number 2. Realm of Why Worry. The single-handed most underrated subchapter in the entire game. Realm of Why Worry takes the UL subchapter experience and refines it to perfection. The first 4 stages here are remakes, but deviate enough from the original to feel like completely original stages. Authority and Gravity has the classic Arost and Pigeon spam combo, but throws in a Cory to add additional wave pressure, completely changing the dynamic of the stage to be much harder. Next up is the infamous Slave to Energy, a stage with many toucans that was so difficult it actually got nerfed by Ponos some updates later. The stage managed to be a difficult black enemy heavy stage in a post-Pizza Wave meta, which is an incredible feat. Raise Your Torches is next, and let's take Red Alert, but how about go with Blue instead this time, and build it around alien enemies? It's one of the most iconic alien heavy stages in the game, and I find it cool that a barrier breaker you might bring to this stage, Kitty of Liberty, quite literally raises his torch to match the stage name. While Despotism at Home isn't the most interesting, it certainly isn't a bad stage, taking Underground's main threat of Triple Bun Bun and adding Big Sal for a unique twist. Unauthorized Breathing is a very challenging array of zombie enemies, and what I'd like to call the first real difficult zombie heavy stage in UL. The end of this subchapter is Bare Fangs at the Throne, which introduces Saint Dober. While Saint Dober isn't the best enemy in most stages in the game, they definitely nailed the introduction stage, making him feel like a very real threat but not as stupid and easily counterable with CC like in other stages. You can choose to either DPS down Saint Dober or lure and fresh down Otham to remove the relic threat, making it a very open challenge to take down. What is just a cherry on top of this already amazing subchapter are the more aesthetic parts of it. The stage names here are some of the best in the game, and the color matching designs on every stage except one make for a very interesting looking experience. It's almost like Theater of Fear, where every stage is composed mainly of one trait, but Realm of Why Worry doesn't fall that too hard to compromise the quality of the overall subchapter. It does it just enough to add a little flair to it, and make the whole package combined the single-handed best subchapter in Uncanny Legends. But there is one subchapter better than this in the game, and it's probably the one you were all expecting from the start. You know it. You love and hate it at the same time. It's number 1, Cutpurse Coast. In my and many other people's opinions, this is the best subchapter in the game. If you were to ask people what the most iconic subchapter in the game was, they'd probably say it was this one. When it was released, Cutpurse Coast was well known to be easily the hardest subchapter overall in the game at that point, and proved to be an immense challenge with its variety of stages. Swim Me is an iconic alien-heavy stage where you have to take down lots of Ursa Majors and Lemurs, and you can do this by luring, stacking backliners, or even a combination of both. Next up is Sea Breeze Salon, a stage with tons of boars and Nimoy boars, along with a Boarfin boss. You can go full DPS down mode and bring your strongest damage dealers, or try to stack up crowd control to disable all the boars in that stage. Deep Sea Dying is next, which is rush cheesable, but if you don't do that, you're going to end up fighting a JK Bun Bun alongside multiple Big Sals. Procrastinator Parade is an infamous stage to this day, fighting off tons of Arosts where you can play with Legend Cycle or just Paris and Midranger spam. Or nowadays, you can just cyberstack if it's too much for you. Grand Exhibition isn't the most exciting stage, just being Toucans and Kurosawa, but it got Regget stuck for a bit so it might be worth something. And who could forget No Return Flights, the hardest stage in the game at the time and arguably the most iconic Legend stage, period. It's an incredibly well-designed combination of Dolphina, Rain D, and Master A to create a deadly force that counters your cat units in a lot of ways. But you can get creative and with the right plan, counter this combination yourself. Whether it be the classic method of mid-rangers and Bahamut, opting to stack hackers to disrupt Dolphina attacks, or even bringing out experimental units like Juliet to get past Dolphina without flinching. There's a lot of ways to approach this stage, and that's the beauty of this subchapter. Every stage is both very challenging and extremely open to how you go about beating them. There's never just one singular way to beat all of these stages. Multiple different strategies in concept exist and can work. This subchapter not only was a genius piece of creativity by Ponos, but it also incentivizes the player's own creativity to come up with their own working strategy like no other subchapter in the game. And with all these iconic stages, built cleanly and with a good amount of challenge, giving the player a unique creative experience like no other, I can safely say that Cutpurse Coast is the best subchapter in the entire game. Wow, that was a long one. But yeah, that was my ranking of every single Legend subchapter in the game. Although this is all just my opinion, I think there are a few things we can learn from this. Is Zero Legends really all that bad? Well, I don't think that ZL overall is super duper bad. Some of the subchapters are lacking overall, but most are pretty average. I think the issue with ZL is more that there haven't been enough high quality peaks like there are with SOL or UL. Only a few subchapters or stages are very notable, and people want to have very good and notable stages to make a saga feel well designed. Then again, if we look back at SOL and UL, we can notice that the majority of their best subchapters were actually right in the middle of them, and that their early subchapters weren't the best either. So while I don't think ZL is up to par right now, I do believe that later on, ZL can become just as good as SOL and UL if done right. So yeah, that's pretty much it from this video. It was a fun one to make, but also a very exhausting one. Special thanks to saltedsweets and Gamechangar for helping me with the ranking, and Adri for doing both that and helping with the script. Have a good day everyone, and I'll see you guys in the next video.